If you're not back
I
in
have
20
to keep
minutes, I'm
moving.
coming after you. If
It's so
I'm not
cold.
back in 20 minutes,
Shh, it's all
I'm
right.
already dead.
We'll
She
be
counted
safe, I
every second.
promise.
900. 15 minutes. Her heart pounding, the door still closed, the blizzard still screaming. And then, 18 minutes. She reached for her coat. But this wasn't where their story began. It started 6 weeks earlier, when a stranger stopped his horse at a dime farm. Winter 1934, Wheeler County, Texas. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the earth like an iron lid on a coffin. The land had given up. Dust devils spun across fields that once grew wheat, leaving nothing but cracks in the ground deep enough to swallow a man's hope. The cottonwood trees stood naked and brittle, their branches scratching at the wind like the fingers of dying men reaching for salvation that would never come. Margaret Hayes knelt on the cold wooden floor of her farmhouse, holding her 3-year-old daughter Ruby in her arms. The child's legs hung limp, curled beneath her like broken twigs. Ruby had stopped crawling 3 days ago. Margaret had seen this before in the field hospitals of France during the Great War. She knew the signs: kwashiorkor, severe protein malnutrition. Without food, Ruby would be dead in 48 hours. Across the room, Thomas, her 8-year-old son, lay sprawled on the porch steps. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Jesse, 5 years old, huddled in the corner, his eyes glazed with the same hollow exhaustion that Margaret had seen in soldiers who had been shelled for 3 days straight. In the wooden cradle by the dying stove, Grace, the baby, 8 months old, had not cried in 2 days. That was the most terrifying sign of all. When babies stop crying, they are already halfway to the grave. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. It carried no moisture, only dust and the promise of death. Margaret looked at the half jar of flour on the kitchen shelf. It was all they had left. That and one hen, Henrietta, the only chicken still laying eggs. But Henrietta had not laid an egg in 4 days. "Mama," Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm cold." Margaret wrapped him in what remained of his father's coat. Jonathan Hayes had been buried 12 days ago at the edge of the minefield where the fence leaned like a drunk trying to find his way home. There had been no coffin, no preacher, no ceremony. Just Margaret and a shovel and 4 children who did not understand why their father would not wake up. She had not cried at the funeral. There had been no time for tears. Tears were a luxury, like food, like warmth, like hope. She was a nurse. She had learned in the trenches of France that crying did not save lives. Action saved lives. But now, kneeling on this freezing floor with her dying children around her, Margaret could feel the wall inside her beginning to crack. A knock at the door. Sharp, official, the kind of knock that came from a man who had never missed a meal. Harold Pritchard stepped inside without waiting for permission. He wore a black suit and a thin tie, and his shoes were polished despite the dust that covered everything in Texas. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the children, the empty shelves, the dying fire. He did not remove his hat. "Mrs. Hayes," his voice was smooth, rehearsed. "I am sorry for your loss, truly, but the bank has obligations. You understand." Margaret stood slowly. She kept Ruby in her arms. The child weighed almost nothing. "How long?" Margaret asked. 7 days. After that, the property reverts to the bank. You may stay a few days longer if needed, but the house will no longer be yours." He said it like he was doing her a favor, like he was a generous man making a difficult sacrifice. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. In France, she had learned to recognize certain types of men. There were men who ran toward the wounded and men who ran away. There were men who shared their rations and men who hoarded them. Harold Pritchard was the kind of man who would step over a dying soldier to keep his boots clean. 7 days, she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. I wish there was more I could do." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You might consider the church. They have a program for widows, charitable assistance." Margaret closed the door in his face. Not gently, hard enough that the frame rattled. For a long moment, she stood with her back against the door. Then, for the first time since Jonathan died, she allowed herself to tremble. Her hands shook, her knees buckled. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, Ruby still in her arms. Thomas crawled over to her. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Margaret looked at her son. 8 years old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be afraid. She reached out and touched his face. His skin was cold. "We're going to leave," she said. "Tomorrow morning. We're going to walk to town." "How far is town?" 15 miles. Thomas looked at his feet. His shoes had holes in them. Jesse's socks were worn through to skin. Ruby could not walk. Grace could not even lift her head. "Can we make it?" Thomas asked. Margaret did not answer. She did not lie to her children. She had learned that in the war too. When a soldier asked if he was going to make it, you did not lie. You told him to fight. You told him to hold on. You told him that you would do everything you could. "We have to try," she said. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She sat by the stove, feeding it splinters of wood from a broken chair, trying to keep the fire alive just a little longer. Ruby lay in her lap. Grace breathed softly in the cradle. Thomas and Jesse slept curled together like puppies, sharing warmth. Margaret's mind drifted back to France. 1918. She had been 23 years old, a volunteer nurse with the American Expeditionary Forces. She had crossed the Atlantic on a ship packed with soldiers who sang and joked and pretended they were not terrified. She had stepped onto French soil, believing she would make a difference, that her skills and her courage would save lives. And she had saved lives. Dozens of them. She had performed amputations with kitchen knives. She had stitched wounds with sewing thread. She had held dying men in her arms and lied to them, telling them they would see their mothers again. She had learned to work through exhaustion, through fear, through the constant thunder of artillery that made the earth shake and the sky turn orange with fire. She had met Jonathan at a field hospital outside Paris. He had been a supply sergeant, quiet and steady with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He had brought her extra blankets when she worked the night shift. He had never tried to impress her, never boasted, never lied. When he asked her to marry him, she said yes, because he felt like safety, like peace, like a future where she would never have to see another man die. They had come to Texas because Jonathan's uncle owned land. They had built this farmhouse with their own hands. They had planted wheat and raised chickens and believed that hard work and faith would be enough. And for a while it had been. Thomas was born, then Jesse, then Ruby, then Grace. 4 children in 8 years. A family, a life. And then the drought came. The wheat died. The chickens died. The bank sent letters. And then Jonathan got sick. Pneumonia. In a city with a doctor and medicine, he might have lived. But they were not in a city. They had no doctor. They had no medicine. Margaret had done everything she knew how to do. She had kept him warm. She had given him water. She had prayed. He died on a Tuesday morning. His last words were an apology. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I failed you." She had wanted to tell him that he had not failed, that he had done his best, that she loved him. But he died before she could say the words. Now, sitting in the cold darkness with her dying children, Margaret wondered if she had failed him. If she had failed all of them. A nurse was supposed to save lives. A mother was supposed to protect her children. But she had no food. She had no medicine. She had nothing but 7 days and 15 miles and a promise she could not keep. She looked down at Ruby. The child's breathing was shallow. Her skin had a grayish tint. Margaret pressed her fingers to Ruby's wrist, counting the pulse. 120 beats per minute. Far too fast. The child's body was shutting down. "I need protein," Margaret whispered to the darkness. "Eggs, meat, milk, anything." Her eyes moved to the corner where Henrietta, the last hen, roosted on a broken crate. The hen was scrawny, barely alive herself. But she was meat, a pound, maybe 2, enough to make broth, enough to give Ruby a few more days. But if she killed Henrietta now, they would have no eggs tomorrow. No eggs meant no protein for Grace. No protein meant the baby would die first. Margaret stood still, holding Ruby. She walked to the corner where Jonathan's hunting knife hung on the wall. She took it down. The blade was dull, but it would do the job. She approached Henrietta. The hen clucked softly, unaware. Margaret raised the knife. Her hand trembled. In France, she had cut into living flesh without hesitation. She had amputated limbs, drained abscesses, opened airways with a scalpel and her bare hands. She had done what needed to be done because there was no choice, because hesitation meant death. But now she hesitated, because killing this hen meant accepting that there would be no tomorrow, no future, only today. Only survival measured in hours, not days. A sound outside, faint at first, then louder. The rhythm of hoofbeats on frozen ground. Margaret set down the knife. She moved to the window, careful not to wake the children. Through the gap in the boards she had nailed over the broken glass, she saw a shape moving through the gray morning light. A rider on horseback coming from the north. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Strangers did not come to this part of Texas anymore. The people who still had the means to leave had already gone. The ones who remained were like her, trapped by poverty and exhaustion, and the simple fact that there was nowhere else to go. The rider drew closer. Margaret could see him now, a tall figure on a heavy horse wearing an oil coat and a felt hat pulled low against the wind. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who was in no hurry because he had nowhere to be. He stopped at the edge of her property, did not dismount, just sat there on his horse, looking at the farmhouse, looking at her. Margaret stepped away from the window. She picked up Jonathan's rifle from beside the door. It had not been fired in 2 years. There were 3 bullets left. She checked the chamber, then moved back to the window. The rider dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post, then started walking toward the house. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a heavy gait that suggested either injury or years of hard labor. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. She held the rifle across her chest, not quite pointing it at him, but making sure he saw it. "We don't need help," she said. The man stopped. He looked at her, then passed her into the house. His eyes moved over Thomas, lying on the steps, Ruby in Margaret's arms, the empty shelves, the dying fire. He took his time, absorbing everything. Then he looked back at Margaret. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky. His face was weathered and hard, with deep lines around his mouth and a beard that had not been trimmed in months. He was older than she had first thought. Mid-30s maybe. But he carried himself like a much older man, like someone who had lived through things that aged you from the inside out. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel under boots. "I can see that." He did not argue, did not insist, did not try to convince her. He just stood there waiting. Margaret tightened her grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" "Name's Samuel Reed. Got a ranch north of here." "What do you want?" "Nothing." "Then why are you here?" Samuel did not answer right away. He looked past her again at Thomas. The boy had tried to sit up but had collapsed back onto the steps. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Your boy all right?" he asked. "He's fine." "He don't look fine." "I said he's fine." Samuel nodded slowly. Then, without asking permission, he stepped past Margaret and knelt beside Thomas. Margaret raised the rifle, but Samuel ignored her. He placed 2 fingers on Thomas's neck, checking his pulse the same way Margaret had checked Ruby's. When he straightened up, his face was grim. "You a nurse?" he asked. Margaret felt a chill run through her. "How did you know?" "The way you wrapped his feet, military standard, and the way you're standing, like you're ready to fight. I've seen it before. Field nurses, France, 1918. Margaret lowered the rifle slightly. "You were there. 1st Division, combat engineer, built field hospitals, bridges, supply lines, whatever needed building." He paused. "Saw nurses like you save men who should have been dead. Saw them work with nothing but gauze and guts." He turned back to Thomas. "This boy needs food and water and warmth. So do the others." Margaret wanted to argue, to tell him to leave, to maintain the wall she had built around herself and her children. But Thomas was lying on the steps, unable to stand. Ruby's pulse was racing towards shutdown. Grace had not made a sound in 2 days. 7 days until the bank took the house. 15 miles to town. Winter. No food, no water, no hope. Samuel straightened up. He looked at Margaret, waiting for her answer. "Why would you help us?" she asked. "Because if I don't, they'll die." His voice was matter-of-fact, without emotion. "And I've seen enough people die. You don't know us. Don't need to. How do I know I can trust you?" For the first time, something flickered in Samuel's eyes. Not anger, something else. Something that looked almost like pain. "You don't," he said, "but you're out of choices." Margaret looked at her children, Thomas on the steps, Ruby in her arms, Jessie curled in the corner, Grace in the cradle. She was a nurse. She knew triage. She knew that when a patient was dying and there was only one option, you took it. You did not waste time debating. You acted. "All right," she whispered. Samuel nodded once. Then, without ceremony, he bent down and lifted Grace from the cradle. He held the baby carefully, supporting her head, like someone who had done this before, like someone who knew how to hold a child. Margaret's breath caught. Watching this stranger hold her baby felt like stepping off a cliff. But Grace did not cry, did not struggle. She just lay in his arms, too weak to do anything else. "I've got a wagon behind the ridge," Samuel said. "Can get them warm, get them fed." He turned and walked out of the house carrying Grace. Margaret stood frozen for a moment. Every instinct screamed at her to stop him, to take Grace back to run. But her legs would not move. Her body knew what her mind was struggling to accept. This man was not a threat. This man was a lifeline. "Thomas," she said softly. "Can you walk?" Thomas tried to stand. His legs buckled. He fell. Samuel came back. Without a word, he bent down and lifted Thomas into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. Samuel carried him out to where his horse, a big roan named Elko, stood waiting. Behind the ridge, hidden from the road, sat a simple wooden wagon, half covered by a stiff canvas tarp. Inside were supplies: blankets, a sack of oats, canned beans, cured meat wrapped in brown paper, and clothes, coats that did not match, gloves with different hands, a pair of small boots. Samuel set Thomas in the back of the wagon, laying him on a folded quilt. Then he went back for Jesse, then Ruby. One by one he carried them, gentle and efficient, like a man who had done this kind of work before. Margaret followed, carrying only what she could hold: a small bag with Jonathan's pocket watch, a photograph of her mother, the knife she had almost used to kill Henrietta. She did not look back at the farmhouse. If she looked back, she might lose her resolve. Samuel helped her into the wagon. She sat in the back with the children, pulling blankets over them, tucking Ruby against her chest. Samuel climbed onto the front bench, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The wagon lurched forward. They rode in silence. The land rolled past, flat and endless and dead. They passed a windmill with its blades torn and hanging at odd angles. They passed a collapsed barn, its roof caved in like a broken spine. They passed a cemetery where wooden crosses leaned at drunken angles, some of them fallen over, completely forgotten by the living and the dead alike. Margaret watched the back of Samuel's head. His shoulders were broad but hunched, as if he carried a weight that could not be seen. His hands on the reins were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked with metal and wood and unforgiving materials. She noticed the way he sat slightly, favoring his left side, as if an old injury still troubled him. "You from around here?" she asked. Samuel did not turn. "North of Shamrock. Used to be cattle country. Still is if a man's stubborn enough." "What's your name?" "Samuel Reed." "You got family?" He was silent for a long moment. "Used to." Margaret did not press. She had learned in the war that some questions were better left unasked. Some wounds did not heal just because you exposed them to light. The children began to fall asleep one by one. The warmth of the blankets, the steady rocking of the wagon, the simple fact that they were moving towards something instead of dying in place. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Margaret found herself staring at a small wooden box tucked under the front bench. It had slid partially out when the wagon hit a rut. She could see the edge of a book inside. Leather-bound. Old. When they hit another bump, the book fell out completely. Margaret picked it up. A cowboy's pocket Bible. The kind soldiers carried in the war. The cover was worn smooth by years of handling. She opened it to the first page. In a child's uneven handwriting, someone had written James Samuel Reed, aged 9. Margaret looked up at Samuel's back. He had gone very still. He knew she had found it. "You have a son," she said. Not a question, a statement. Samuel's shoulders tensed. Had. He's in Kansas with his mother. The words came out flat, empty. Margaret had heard that tone before, in the voices of men who had lost everything and were too tired to pretend it did not hurt. "How long since you've seen him?" 4 years. "That's a long time." "It is." Margaret closed the book carefully. She placed it back in the box, making sure it was secure. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was my choice. I let them go." "Why?" Samuel turned slightly enough that she could see his profile. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. "Because staying was killing her. My wife, Elizabeth. She wasn't built for this life. She was from Boston. Thought Texas would be romantic. Wide open spaces. Freedom. But when the reality hit, when she understood what it meant to live out here with no neighbors and no church and no society, she started to fade, like a plant without water. He paused. The wagon creaked. Elko's hooves thudded against the hard ground. When James was 7, she told me she was leaving. Said she'd take him with her. I could have fought it, could have made her stay. But I looked at her and I saw what this place was doing to her, and I knew I couldn't keep her where just because I was too stubborn to let go. So I let them leave. Told myself it was the right thing to do. Do you regret it? Every single day. Margaret held Ruby tighter. Why did you stop for us? Samuel did not answer for a long time. The wagon rolled on. The sun began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the dead fields. Finally, he said, because I couldn't save them, but maybe I can save you. An hour passed, maybe more. Margaret lost track of time. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she could not tell if it was morning or afternoon, winter or eternity. But then she smelled something. Wood smoke. Faint at first, then stronger. She looked up. Ahead beyond a line of cedar trees, she saw a gate made of split posts. Beyond the gate, a small ranch house, square and simple, with smoke rising from a metal chimney. Samuel did not announce their arrival. He simply drove the wagon through the gate and stopped in front of the house. He climbed down, tied Elko to a post, then came around to the back. I can carry them, Margaret said, reaching for Ruby. You don't have to. I know, but her hands were shaking. She could not stop them. Samuel saw. He did not argue. He just lifted Ruby from her arms and carried the child inside. Margaret followed with grace. Thomas and Jesse stumbled after them, too weak to do anything but shuffle forward like old men. The house smelled of pine and old wood. The floors creaked. The windows were covered with thick quilts to keep out the wind. A fire burned in the hearth, low but steady, throwing orange light across the walls. Samuel set Ruby down on a quilt near the fire. Kitchen's through there. Water pump out, back still works, though it's stiff when it's cold. I'll bring some in. Margaret nodded. She knelt beside Ruby, loosening the child's wrappings. The warmth made her dizzy. She could feel blood returning to her fingers, like needles pushing through frozen flesh. Behind her, Samuel moved through the house. Boots scuffing, door opening, closing, the sound of water sloshing in a pail. Then from the kitchen, the clank of a pan, the smell of bacon and beans, the rich, heavy scent of fat melting. Margaret's stomach clenched. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had given what little food they had to the children. But now, smelling food, real food, she felt a wave of hunger so intense it was almost painful. The children stirred. Thomas sat up slowly. Jesse opened his eyes. Even Ruby seemed to respond to the smell, turning her head toward the kitchen. Samuel appeared in the doorway holding plates. He set them down on the table. Bacon, beans, cornbread, simple food. But to Margaret, it looked like a feast. Eat slow, she told the children. Your stomachs aren't used to it. They ate, slowly at first, cautious as deer, then faster. Jesse sighed and leaned against the table crumbs stuck to his cheek. Thomas ate until his plate was clean, then looked at Margaret with a question in his eyes. Can I have more? Margaret nodded. Her throat was tight. She could not speak. Samuel did not sit. He stood near the stove, arms folded, watching. Not staring at Margaret. Not looking at her like some men did, with hunger or judgment or pity. He watched the children. And when his eyes did move to Margaret, it was not with desire or curiosity. It was with something else. Something that looked like recognition. Like he saw in her what he saw in himself. Someone who had survived. Someone who was still trying to figure out why. After the children had eaten, Samuel showed Margaret to the back room. It was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out over the empty fields. The bed was made, the blanket folded with military precision. You can sleep here, he said. I'll stay by the fire. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. Margaret looked at him. Why? Samuel did not answer right away. He looked past her out the window at the land that stretched away to nothing. Because he said slowly, my son used to sleep in that room. And every night since he left, I've walked past that door and felt like I failed him. Like I should have fought harder to keep him here. Or gone with him. Or done something other than just let him go. He turned to face her. You and your children, you're not a burden. You're a reminder that maybe I can still do something right. Margaret did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She just nodded. Samuel left, closing the door behind him. Margaret stood alone in the small room, listening to the sound of the children settling by the fire, to the crackle of burning wood, to the wind outside that no longer sounded like a predator, but just like wind. She sat down on the bed. It was the first time in 12 days that she had sat on something soft. The first time she had been warm. The first time she had felt even for a moment safe. She lay back, closed her eyes, and for the first time since Jonathan died, she allowed herself to sleep. Outside in the main room, Samuel sat by the fire. He held the small Bible in his hands, the one with James's name written inside. He opened it to the first page, running his finger over the uneven letters. His son's handwriting. 9 years old when he wrote it. 11 now, growing up in Kansas without his father. Samuel closed the book. He set it aside. Then he covered his face with his hands. And in the silence of the empty house, with 4 strangers sleeping just a few feet away, Samuel Reed allowed himself to weep. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way men weep when they think no one is watching. The way men weep when they have lost something they will never get back. Margaret, lying in the back room, heard him. She did not go to him, did not try to comfort him. She understood in the way that only someone who has also lost everything can understand, that some grief is too private to share. Some wounds are too deep to touch. But she understood something else too. This man, this stranger who had saved her children, was not saving them out of charity or pity or religious duty. He was saving them because he had failed to save his own family. And this was his second chance, his redemption. And maybe Margaret thought, as sleep finally claimed her, maybe he was her second chance too. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside Samuel Reed's house, for the first time in a long time, there was warmth. There was food. There was hope. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the dead fields of Texas, they would begin the hard work of learning how to live again. The first morning came slowly, like a cautious animal approaching a wounded companion. Margaret woke to a sound she had not heard in weeks: birdsong. Just one bird, a lone voice from the trees beyond the barn, but it was enough. It meant the world had not ended. Not yet. She lay still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the blanket, the softness of the mattress beneath her. Her body ached in a way that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with the simple fact that she had finally, after 12 days of fear and cold and hunger, allowed herself to rest. Her muscles had been clenched so tight for so long that now released they throbbed with exhaustion. Grace lay beside her, breathing softly, one tiny fist curled against Margaret's collar. The baby's color was better, her breathing deeper. Margaret pressed her fingers to Grace's wrist, counting. 90 beats per minute, still elevated, but better than yesterday's 120. Better meant alive. Better meant hope. Margaret rose carefully so as not to wake Grace. She moved through the house like a ghost, checking each child. Thomas slept on a pallet near the fire, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. No cough, no wheeze. Jesse lay curled beside him, one arm thrown over his brother's chest, his face peaceful, in a way Margaret had not seen since Jonathan died. And Ruby, her sweet Ruby, who had not walked in days, lay on her side with her legs drawn up beneath the blanket. Margaret knelt beside Ruby. She pulled back the blanket and examined the child's legs. The skin was still pale, the muscles atrophied from disuse. She pressed her thumb against Ruby's shin, testing for edema. The flesh did not indent. Good. That meant the swelling was going down. But when Margaret tried to flex Ruby's knee, the joint moved stiffly, reluctantly. The child did not wake, did not respond to the touch. Margaret had seen this before. In the trenches, soldiers who went too long without proper nutrition developed the same wasting syndrome. Protein deficiency attacked the muscles, causing weakness, edema, and if left untreated, death. The cure was simple food rich in protein. Eggs, meat, beans, milk if they could get it. But simple did not mean easy, not when you had nothing. She stood and moved to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was still burning, fed with fresh wood. Samuel must have risen before dawn to tend it. Margaret found a pot of water heating on the stovetop, steam rising in gentle curls. Beside it, a plate covered with a cloth. She lifted the corner. Cornbread and bacon still warm. Her stomach growled so loudly she pressed a hand against it, embarrassed even though no one was there to hear. She had given most of her food to the children yesterday, had eaten only a few bites herself. Now her body was demanding payment for that sacrifice. But she did not eat. Not yet. First Ruby. Margaret searched the kitchen shelves. She found oats, dried beans, a small piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She knew what to do. She had treated beriberi in France, had seen men recover when given the right diet. The key was consistency. Small meals high in thiamine spread throughout the day. She built a fire in the stove, added wood until it roared. Then she filled a pot with water and oats, added a piece of the salt pork for flavor and nutrition. While it cooked, she crushed some of the dried beans into powder, mixing them with a little water to create a paste. The beans were rich in B vitamins. The pork would provide protein and thiamine. Together, they might be enough. You know what you're doing. Margaret turned. Samuel stood in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow that had not been there yesterday. His face was red from cold, his breath visible in the air. He had been outside for hours. I've treated this before, Margaret said. In the war, severe malnutrition, soldiers without proper rations. If I can get Ruby enough protein over the next 2 weeks, she'll walk again. Samuel nodded slowly. He did not question her diagnosis, did not offer useless advice. He simply accepted what she said as fact. What do you need? Time and food. You've got both. He moved to the stove, warming his hands over the heat. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was older than she had first thought. Late 30s, perhaps. His face was lined not just with age, but with the kind of deep grooves that come from years of squinting into sun and wind. His hands were large and scarred, the knuckles swollen with old injuries. His left shoulder sat slightly lower than his right, suggesting an injury that had never fully healed. You were out early, Margaret said. Animals don't wait for sunrise. You have animals. A few, chickens, 2 cows, the horse. Not much, but enough to keep a man busy. Margaret stirred the oatmeal. I can help, with the animals, with the work. Samuel looked at her. You don't have to. Not yet. Yes, I do. She met his eyes. I won't be a burden. You're not a burden. Then let me work. Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. You ever milk a cow? Every morning for 8 years. Then you can handle Bess. She's temperamental, but if you scratch behind her ears, she'll cooperate. He paused. Chickens need feeding too. Water troughs are frozen. I'll heat a kettle to thaw them out. They worked in silence, side by side, moving around each other with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that survival required coordination, not conversation. Samuel showed her where the feed was kept, where the milk pails hung, how the barn door stuck and needed to be lifted slightly while pulling. Margaret absorbed it all, filing away each detail the way she had once memorized the layout of field hospitals, the location of supplies, the quickest routes between tents. Outside, the air was sharp enough to cut. Margaret wrapped herself in one of Samuel's old coats. It was far too large, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but it was warm. The barn smelled of hay and animal heat, a rich organic scent that was surprisingly comforting after weeks of smelling only dust and decay. Bess the milk cow watched Margaret approach with suspicious eyes. Samuel had not lied. The animal was temperamental. She shifted her weight, swishing her tail in warning. Easy, girl, Margaret murmured. She reached out slowly and scratched behind the cow's ears the way Samuel had instructed. Bess huffed but did not move away. Margaret took that as permission. She settled onto the low stool, positioned the pail, and began to milk. The rhythm came back to her immediately. Pull, squeeze, release, pull, squeeze, release. The milk hissed into the bucket, frothy and white. Bess gradually relaxed her breathing, slowing. Margaret leaned her forehead against the cow's warm flank and felt for the first time in weeks useful. Not just a woman fleeing death, not just a mother protecting children, but a person with skills, with value. When she returned to the house, Samuel was chopping wood behind the barn. Margaret watched him for a moment through the window. He worked with methodical precision, each stroke of the axe placed exactly where it needed to be. No wasted motion, no showmanship, just efficiency born of long practice. Thomas appeared at her elbow. Mama, can I go help him? Margaret looked down at her son. His color was better, his eyes clearer. You feel strong enough? Yes, ma'am. Then go, but if you get tired, you come right back. Understand? Thomas nodded and bolted for the door. Margaret watched as he approached Samuel, who paused mid-swing. The two of them stood talking for a moment too far away for Margaret to hear. Then Samuel handed Thomas a piece of wood and pointed to a spot on the chopping block. Thomas placed the wood, carefully stepped back, and Samuel brought the axe down, splitting the log cleanly. Thomas's face lit up. He picked up the split pieces and added them to the pile, then hurried back for another log. Samuel did not tell him to slow down or be careful or watch out. He simply let the boy work, correcting his form when needed, but otherwise treating him like a capable person, not a fragile child. Margaret turned away from the window. She had work to do. Ruby needed to eat. She carried the bowl of oatmeal to where Ruby lay. The child was awake now, her eyes tracking Margaret's movements, but her body still. Margaret sat cross-legged on the floor and lifted Ruby into her lap. "Sweetheart, I need you to eat this." Margaret held a spoonful to Ruby's lips. The child opened her mouth obediently, but did not chew. Margaret had to mash the oatmeal against Ruby's palate with the spoon, working it around until the child finally swallowed. It took 30 minutes to get half the bowl into her. Margaret's back ached from holding the position, but she did not stop. Could not stop. This was medicine. This was life. Every spoonful was a small victory against the thing that was trying to kill her daughter. When Ruby finally refused to eat more, Margaret set the bowl aside and held the child against her chest, rocking gently. "You're going to get better," she whispered. "I promise. You're going to walk again. You're going to run and play and be strong, I promise." Ruby did not respond, but she nestled closer, her small body warm and trusting. That night, after the children had eaten and been put to bed, Margaret sat by the fire with Samuel. He was mending a broken hinge, his large hands working the screwdriver with surprising delicacy. Margaret sewed a tear in Thomas's coat, using thread she had found in a sewing kit tucked into a drawer. They did not speak for a long time. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words were not always necessary, that sometimes the simple act of being in the same space was enough. Finally, Margaret set down her sewing. "Samuel, I need to ask you something." He looked up. "Your son, James. Why did you let him go?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He set down the hinge and the screwdriver. For a moment, Margaret thought he would refuse to answer, but then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Elizabeth, my wife, she was a city woman. Educated, refined. She married me because she thought I was different from the men she knew in Boston. She thought I represented something authentic, real. But when we got here, when she realized what real meant, no running water, no neighbors within 5 miles, no theater or society, or anything she considered civilization, she started to wither." He opened his eyes, staring at the fire. "I tried. I built her the best house I could. I brought her books from town. I took her to church when the circuit preacher came through. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't happy. And when you love someone, you have to decide, do you keep them in a cage because you're afraid of losing them, or do you let them fly even if it means they fly away?" So you let her go. I let them both go. James was 7, old enough to understand what was happening, but not old enough to choose for himself. Elizabeth said Kansas would be better for him, schools, friends, a future that didn't involve breaking your back on dead land. He paused. She wasn't wrong. "Do you regret it?" "Every day, but that doesn't mean it was the wrong choice." Margaret picked up her sewing again. "James wrote to you in that Bible. He remembered you. He was 9 when he wrote that. He's 11 now, children forget." "Not always, not the important things." Samuel looked at her. "You think I should write to him?" "I think children need their fathers, even if their fathers aren't perfect." Samuel did not respond, but something in his face softened just slightly. A small crack in the wall he had built around himself. 3 days passed, then a week. Ruby ate small meals every 3 hours, and slowly, gradually, color began to return to her face. Her pulse steadied. Her breathing deepened. On the 10th day, while Margaret was feeding her lunch, Ruby's right foot twitched. It was small, just a tiny movement, but Margaret saw it. She set down the bowl and knelt beside Ruby, placing her hand on the child's leg. "Ruby, can you move your foot for me? Try, sweetheart. Just try." Ruby's face scrunched with effort. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then slowly her toes curled. just slightly, but they moved. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Good girl. That's so good. You're getting stronger. Over the next 4 days, the movement increased. Ruby could flex her ankles, then bend her knees. On the 14th day, Margaret helped her stand. Ruby's legs shook violently, and she could only hold the position for a few seconds before collapsing back into Margaret's arms. But she had stood. Thomas and Jessie cheered. Grace clapped her pudgy hands, not understanding what was happening, but caught up in the excitement. And Samuel, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was there. That night, Margaret found Samuel sitting on the porch looking out at the dark fields. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him. Thank you, she said. For what? For this, for all of it, for saving us. Samuel shook his head. I didn't save you. You saved yourself. You're the one who knew how to treat Ruby. You're the one who kept your children alive for 12 days with nothing. I just gave you a place to do it. You gave us more than that. You gave us hope. Samuel did not respond, but he did not pull away when Margaret placed her hand on his arm. They sat like that for a long time, two people who had survived things they should not have survived, finding comfort in the simple fact that they were not alone. On the 21st day, a rider came. Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw him approaching, a young man on a tired horse carrying a leather satchel. He dismounted at the gate and called out, Samuel Reed. Samuel emerged from the barn. That's me. The young man pulled 2 envelopes from his satchel, mail from town, one from the state, one from a railroad company. Samuel took the letters. His face darkened as he read the return addresses. Appreciate it. The young man rode away. Samuel stood holding the letters, not opening them. Margaret approached laundry forgotten. What is it? Samuel handed her the first letter. She opened it. Dear Mr. Reed, the state of Texas is acquiring land for public works projects. Your property has been selected for potential acquisition. You have 30 days to accept our offer, or the state will exercise eminent domain. Offer $500, current assessed market value $2,000. Sincerely, Texas Land Commission. Margaret felt cold. They're taking your land. Trying to. She opened the second letter. Mr. Reed, I represent Southern Pacific Railroad Company. We are prepared to offer $800 for your property, significantly more than the state's offer. However, this is a time-sensitive opportunity. You have 10 days to accept. Contact me at the address below. Respectfully, Owen Blackwell Lane. Land acquisition agent. Margaret looked up at Samuel. They're forcing you out. Not the first time someone's tried. What will you do? Samuel folded the letters carefully. His face was unreadable. I don't know yet. But Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been backed into a corner and was trying to decide whether to fight or surrender. 2 days later, Owen Blackwell arrived in person. Margaret was in the garden teaching Jessie how to identify which plants might survive the winter when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up to see a man riding toward the house on a sleek black horse. He was older, perhaps 50, with silver hair beneath a black fedora. He wore a suit expensive and well-tailored, completely inappropriate for rural Texas. 2 other men rode behind him, younger, harder-looking. They had the bearing of hired muscle. Samuel stepped out of the barn, his hand resting on the rifle propped against the doorframe. He did not pick it up. Not yet. But the message was clear. Owen Blackwell dismounted with practiced ease. He smiled, showing white teeth. Mr. Reed, Owen Blackwell, I believe you received my letter. I did. Excellent. Then you understand the opportunity I'm offering. $800, cash. More than fair in these difficult times. I'm not selling. Blackwell's smile did not waver. Mr. Reed, let's be reasonable. The state wants this land. If you don't sell to me, they'll take it anyway through eminent domain, and you'll get half what I'm offering. Why not take the better deal? Because it's my land, my father's land, and I'm not giving it up. Blackwell's eyes flicked past Samuel to where Margaret stood with Jessie. His expression shifted just slightly. Calculation. Assessment. I see you have responsibilities now, Blackwell said smoothly. A family to think about. A man in your position should consider what's best for them, not just for himself. Margaret felt anger flash through her. She picked up Jesse and walked toward the house, but not before she saw Samuel's hands curl into fists. My responsibilities are my business, Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. Not yours. Blackwell raised his hands in a placating gesture. Of course, of course. I meant no offense. I'm simply suggesting that $800 could give your family a fresh start somewhere else, somewhere with more opportunity. We're not leaving. Mr. Reed, I understand pride, truly. But pride doesn't feed children. Pride doesn't keep them warm in winter. Money does. Samuel took a step forward. Get off my land. Blackwell's smile finally faded. You have 10 days to reconsider. After that, the offer decreases. Or worse, the state moves forward with their claim and you get nothing. Think about it, Reed. Think about what you're risking. He mounted his hand with deliberate slowness, making sure Samuel understood that he was leaving by choice, not because he was intimidated. The two men behind him followed suit. 9 days, Mr. Reed, Blackwell called as he rode away. I hope you make the right decision. After they left, Samuel stood in the yard for a long time, staring at nothing. Margaret came out of the house and stood beside him. You should sell, she said quietly. Samuel turned to look at her, surprise evident in his face. What? Take the money, start over somewhere else. This is my father's land. And if you lose it for nothing, if the state takes it and you get zero, then what? I've lost things before. I can lose again. Margaret stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at her. But it's not just you anymore. There's me. There's the children. If you lose this land trying to fight them, we have nowhere to go. Samuel's face hardened. You think I don't know that? You think I don't lie awake at night thinking about what happens if I fail again? Then don't fail. Take the money. We'll find another place. There is no other place. His voice rose the first time she had heard real anger from him. $800 doesn't buy a ranch in 1934. It buys maybe a year of rent in some city where I don't know how to live doing and work. I don't know how to do. And then what? When the money runs out. That's a problem for later. At least we'd be alive to face it. Samuel turned away from her. I can't do it, Margaret. I can't walk away from this place. It's all I have left of my father, all I have left of the life I tried to build with Elizabeth and James. If I give it up, what am I? Just a man who runs when things get hard. Just a man who couldn't hold on to anything. Margaret felt frustration and fear warring inside her. You're more than this land, Samuel. You're the man who saved my children, who gave us hope when we had none. That's worth more than dirt and fence posts. He did not respond. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice softer. I'm scared. Samuel looked at her. Of what? Of this, of you, of feeling safe again. Because every time I've felt safe, it's been taken away. And I can't go through that again. I can't watch you lose everything trying to protect something that might not even matter in the end. Samuel's expression softened. He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. This matters, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. My father taught me that a man doesn't run from a fight just because the odds are bad. He stands his ground. He does what's right, even if it costs him everything. And if what's right is accepting that you can't win, then I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, but not before I've tried. Margaret wanted to argue more, wanted to make him see reason, but she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look she had seen in soldiers who refused to retreat even when they were surrounded. The same look Jonathan had when he insisted they could make the farm work despite the drought. It was the look of a man who would rather die than surrender. She turned and walked back into the house, her heart heavy with dread. That night, neither of them spoke much. They moved around each other with careful politeness, like strangers sharing a waiting room. The warmth that had been growing between them had been replaced by a cold distance, and Margaret hated it. But she did not know how to bridge the gap without compromising what she believed. 3 days later, the storm came. It started as a change in the wind. Samuel noticed it first standing outside in the pre-dawn darkness. The air had shifted, blowing now from the north instead of the west. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an hour. He came inside and found Margaret already awake, nursing Grace by the fire. Storm's coming, he said. Big one. Margaret looked up. How long? Few hours, maybe less. We need to prepare. They worked with urgent efficiency. Samuel and Thomas reinforced the chicken coop, nailing extra boards across the door. Jesse helped Margaret move all the animals' water inside where it would not freeze solid. Ruby, now able to walk short distances with support, helped by holding tools and fetching supplies. By mid-morning, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. The wind increased, howling around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. The first snow began to fall. Not gentle flakes, but hard pellets of ice that struck the windows like thrown gravel. Samuel brought in as much firewood as he could carry, stacking it by the stove until there was barely room to walk. Margaret cooked food, anything that could be eaten cold if the fire went out. Beans, cornbread, salt pork. They filled every container they had with water from the pump, knowing that once the storm hit, they would not be able to go outside. By noon, the storm was in full fury. Snow fell so thick they could not see the barn from the house. The wind screamed, shaking the walls, making the windows rattle in their frames. The temperature inside the house dropped steadily, despite the fire roaring in the stove. The children huddled together in blankets, their eyes wide. Margaret kept them busy with stories and games, trying to distract them from the terrifying sounds outside. But she could see the fear in their faces. They had survived starvation. Now they had to survive this. The power went out, though they had no electricity to begin with. But the storm was so dark that even at midday, the house was filled with shadows. Samuel lit kerosene lamps, their golden light pushing back the darkness just enough to see. They ate dinner early while they still had light and warmth. Afterwards, Samuel checked the fire in the stove. He frowned. "We're burning through wood faster than I thought," he said quietly to Margaret. "The wind's pulling heat out of the house faster than we can replace it. How much do we have left?" "Enough for tonight. Maybe. But if this storm lasts into tomorrow, we'll be in trouble." Margaret looked at the children. Their lips were already tinged blue despite the blankets. Ruby was shivering. "What can we do?" "I need to get more wood from the shed." "Samuel, you can't go out in that. You'll freeze." "If we don't have wood, we'll all freeze. In here." Margaret grabbed his arm. "There has to be another way." Samuel looked around the house. His eyes landed on the furniture, the chairs, the table, the bed frame in the back room. "I can burn furniture." "Then do that." "It won't be enough. Furniture burns fast, hot but fast. We need logs, dense wood that burns slow and steady." "How far is the shed?" 30 yards. "Maybe 40 in this storm." Margaret did some quick calculations. 30 yards in a blizzard, zero visibility. Temperature probably 20 below with wind chill, frostbite in minutes, hypothermia in less than an hour. But without wood, they would freeze inside the house by morning. "How much can you carry?" "Enough for tonight and tomorrow, if I make 2 trips." "1 trip," Margaret said firmly. "You go out once. You get what you can carry, and you come back. Understood?" Samuel nodded. Understood. He dressed in layers, 2 pairs of pants, 2 shirts, his heavy oil coat, gloves, a scarf wrapped around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He picked up a coil of rope. "I'm going to tie this to the porch rail, follow it to the shed, use it to find my way back. If you're not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming after you." "No, you're not. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, I'm already dead, and you need to save the children. Burn the furniture, all of it. And if that's not enough, take them to the barn. The animals' body heat will keep them warmer." Margaret wanted to protest, to argue, to forbid him from going. But she was a nurse. She understood triage, understood that sometimes the only choice was between bad and worse. 20 minutes, she repeated. Samuel tied one end of the rope to the porch rail. Then he opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. Snow swirled in through the open door, coating the floor in seconds. Samuel lowered his head and pushed forward into the white chaos. Margaret slammed the door behind him. She stood with her back against the door, counting seconds in her head. 60 seconds to a minute. 20 minutes. 1,200 seconds. She would count every one. The children crowded around her. "Where's Mr. Reed going?" Thomas asked. "To get firewood." "In the storm?" "Yes." "Is he coming back?" Margaret looked at her son. She would not lie to him. "I don't know." 300 seconds. 5 minutes. Margaret added more wood to the fire. Not too much, they had to conserve, but enough to keep the temperature from dropping further. 600 seconds. 10 minutes. Ruby started crying. Not loudly, just soft, frightened whimpers. Margaret picked her up, holding her close. 900 seconds. 15 minutes. Margaret's heart was pounding now. She moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. She could see nothing. Just white. Just wind. Just the storm trying to kill them all. 1,080 seconds. 18 minutes. Margaret put Ruby down gently and moved to the door. She pulled on her coat. "Mama, what are you doing?" Thomas asked. "Checking on Mr. Reed." "You said 20 minutes. It's been long enough." Thomas stood. "Then I'm coming with you." "No, you stay here. You're the oldest. If something happens to me, you take care of your brother and sisters. You understand?" Thomas's face was white, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret reached for the door handle. The door burst open before she could touch it. Samuel fell through, carried by the wind. He landed on his hands and knees, gasping, covered in ice and snow. Behind him, a massive bundle of firewood tumbled across the threshold. Margaret and Thomas grabbed him, dragging him fully inside. Margaret kicked the door shut and threw the bolt. Samuel lay on the floor, chest heaving. Ice had formed on his beard, on his eyebrows, on the scarf wrapped around his face. His gloves were frozen solid. "Get those gloves off," Margaret ordered. She knelt beside him, pulling at the stiff leather. It did not budge. "Thomas, get me a knife. Hurry." Thomas ran to the kitchen and returned with a paring knife. Margaret cut through the frozen gloves, sawing carefully. When she finally pulled them free, she saw Samuel's hands. The fingertips were white, frostbite. "We need warm water, not hot. Warm, and towels." Jessie ran to get the supplies. Margaret cradled Samuel's hands in hers. They were like ice. No feeling. No response when she pressed her thumb against his palm. "Can you feel this?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. His teeth were chattering so hard he could not speak. Jessie returned with a basin of water and towels. Margaret guided Samuel's hands into the water. He hissed in pain as sensation began to return. The pain was good. Pain meant the tissue was alive. No pain meant permanent damage. She held his hands in the water for 10 minutes, slowly increasing the temperature. Samuel gritted his teeth, breathing hard through his nose. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cold. Margaret knew how much it hurt. She had treated frostbite before. The return of blood flow felt like being stabbed with hot needles. When she finally removed his hands from the water, the fingertips were red and swollen, but not black. Not dead. He would keep his fingers. Probably. "You fool," Margaret said, wrapping his hands in towels. "You could have died." "But I didn't," Samuel managed through chattering teeth. "You could have lost your hands." "But I didn't." Margaret wanted to slap him, wanted to scream at him, but instead she pulled him close and held him, feeling the cold radiating from his body, feeling him shake against her. "Don't you ever do that again." Samuel did not answer. He just sat there, letting her hold him, too exhausted and too cold to do anything else. Thomas and Jessie dragged the wood inside. It was a huge pile, enough for 2 days at least. Samuel had carried far more than Margaret thought possible. He had nearly killed himself doing it, but he had saved them. They spent the rest of the night by the fire, all of them together. The children slept in a pile like puppies. Margaret and Samuel sat with their backs against the wall, shoulders touching feeding wood to the flames. They did not talk. There was nothing to say that had not already been said by action. At some point, deep in the night, Margaret felt herself starting to doze. She tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. Her head drooped. Samuel shifted and she found herself leaning against him, her head on his shoulder. He did not push her away. He just sat there, solid and warm, letting her rest. When she woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the windows. The storm had passed. Samuel was still beside her, his eyes closed, his breathing deep. His hands were bandaged with strips of cloth. Margaret had done that sometime in the night, though she did not remember. She looked at his face. In sleep, he looked younger. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He looked for just a moment peaceful. Margaret thought about waking him, but instead she stayed still, letting him sleep, grateful that they had both survived the night. Outside, the world was buried in snow. But inside Samuel Reed's house, the fire still burned. And 7 people who had come so close to death were still alive, still together, still holding on. The storm had tested them, and they had not broken. In the weeks that followed the storm, something shifted between them. It happened gradually in small moments, a lingering touch when passing plates at dinner, a shared glance across the room that lasted a heartbeat too long, the way Samuel's hand found the small of her back when they worked side by side. One night after the children were asleep, Margaret found Samuel sitting by the fire staring at the flames. She sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The silence said everything words could not. When he turned to look at her, she saw in his eyes the same longing she felt in her own heart. What happened next felt inevitable, like water flowing downhill, like seeds reaching towards sunlight. Natural. Right. Terrifying and beautiful all at once. The morning after the storm revealed a world transformed. Snow covered everything, smoothing over the rough edges of the land, making it look almost peaceful. But Samuel knew better. He stood on the porch, surveying the damage. The fence on the north side had collapsed under the weight of ice and wind. The chicken coop's roof sagged dangerously. And worst of all, when he tried the water pump, he heard a sound that made his stomach drop, the metallic crack of frozen broken metal. He worked the handle again. Nothing. The pump was dead. Margaret appeared beside him, wrapped in a blanket. "What's wrong?" Piston cracked, seals broken. Samuel knelt and examined the mechanism. "We can't get water. How long can we survive without it?" 3 days, maybe 4 if we melt snow. But that takes fuel, and we already burned through most of our wood last night. Thomas came out of the house, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked at the broken pump, then at Samuel. "Can we fix it?" Samuel straightened up, brushing snow from his knees. "Not without parts. The pistons cracked clean through. We'd need a machine shop to fabricate a new one." "Or we could make one," Thomas said quietly. Samuel and Margaret both turned to look at him. "You taught me about pistons, Mr. Reed. How they work. How they move. What if we made a new one? You have got tools in your workshop. Metal pipes. You said you can weld anything." Samuel stared at the boy. Thomas was 8 years old, thin as a reed, still recovering from near starvation. But his eyes were bright with intelligence, with the kind of problem-solving instinct that could not be taught, only recognized and nurtured. "You're right," Samuel said slowly. "I can weld. I've got some old pipes in the barn. Might be able to fashion something." He looked at Thomas. "You want to help?" Thomas's face lit up. "Yes, sir." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Samuel cleared a space in his workshop, a small shed attached to the barn where he kept his tools. Welding equipment, wrenches, files, hammers, everything. A combat engineer learns to use when building field hospitals and bridges under fire. Thomas watched, asked questions, handed tools when requested. Samuel cut a section from an old pipe, measuring it against the broken piston. "Too wide, we need to file it down." He showed Thomas how to use the file, how to work the metal with steady, even strokes. "Not too fast, you'll heat the metal and warp it. Slow and steady." Thomas took the file and began to work. His movements were awkward at first, but he learned quickly, adjusting his grip, finding the rhythm. Samuel watched with something that felt dangerously close to pride. Margaret brought them food at noon, cold cornbread and beans. She found them covered in metal shavings, their breath visible in the cold air of the workshop, both utterly focused on the piece of metal taking shape in Thomas's hands. "How's it going?" she asked. Samuel held up the modified pipe. "Getting there. Still need to fabricate a seal, then test it. And if it doesn't work, then we melt snow and hope it's enough until the thaw comes, but it'll work." He glanced at Thomas. "Your boy's got good hands. Engineer's hands." Thomas ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Jonathan had loved their children, but he had never looked at Thomas the way Samuel did. With respect, with recognition. Jonathan had seen a child. Samuel saw a capable person. By late afternoon, they had fashioned a new piston from the pipe, created a seal from leather and rubber, and reassembled the pump. Samuel worked the handle, slowly testing the mechanism. It stuck at first, the new parts stiff and unfamiliar. But then with a groan and a shudder, water began to flow. Just a trickle at first, then a steady stream, clear and cold. Thomas whooped with joy. Jesse and Ruby, watching from the porch, started clapping. Even Grace, sitting on Margaret's hip, giggled at the excitement. Samuel rested his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We did it, son. We fixed it." "No, you figured it out. I just helped." Thomas looked up at Samuel with something approaching worship in his eyes. Margaret understood. This boy had watched his father die unable to save him, had nearly died himself. And now he had fixed something, had solved a problem, had proven that he was not helpless. That was a powerful thing for a child to feel. That evening, as they sat around the fire, warm and fed and safe, Samuel allowed himself to believe just for a moment that maybe they would be all right, that maybe he could protect these people who had somehow become his family. The belief lasted exactly 36 hours. On the morning of the 33rd day since Margaret had arrived, another rider came to the ranch. But this time it was not a messenger. It was Owen Blackwell himself, and he had not come alone. Margaret saw them first. She was in the garden checking to see if any of her planted seeds had survived the storm when she heard hoofbeats. Multiple horses. She stood and shaded her eyes against the winter sun. 3 riders approached. Owen Blackwell on his sleek black horse, flanked by 2 younger men who sat their saddles with the easy confidence of people who knew how to use violence. They were not farmhands. They were hired muscle, the kind of men who worked for cattle barons and railroad companies when persuasion failed and force became necessary. Samuel emerged from the barn. He saw the riders and immediately understood what they represented. He moved to the porch, picked up his rifle, and held it across his chest. Not aiming, not threatening, just present. Owen Blackwell rode to the edge of the property and dismounted. The 2 men with him stayed on their horses, hands resting casually on their gun belts. Blackwell smiled, all white teeth and false charm. "Mr. Reed, my deadline has passed. I'm aware. Yet you did not respond to my generous offer. That's because I'm not selling." Blackwell's smile thinned. "Mr. Reed, I understand you're a stubborn man. I respect that. Truly. But stubbornness without wisdom is just foolishness. The state is moving forward with eminent domain. You will lose this property. The only question is whether you get compensated for it or not. Then I guess we'll see what happens." Blackwell's eyes moved past Samuel to where Margaret stood with Jesse. He took in her worn dress, her calloused hands, the way she held the boy close. "Mrs. Hayes, I've heard about you. The widow who showed up with dying children. Found refuge with Mr. Reed." His tone was pleasant, but there was something underneath it, something calculating. "Tell me, does Mr. Reed strike you as the kind of man who makes good decisions? The kind who thinks about the future?" Margaret felt anger flash through her like lightning. She handed Jesse to Ruby, who had come to stand beside her, and walked toward Blackwell. She did not stop until she was within arm's reach. "Mr. Blackwell, and I was a nurse in the Great War, Army Nurse Corps. I served in France with the 1st Division. I've seen enough men like you to know exactly what you are." Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what am I?" "A vulture. The kind of man who circles the wounded, waiting for them to die so you can pick their bones clean." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. Blackwell held up a hand, stopping him. "Strong words, Mrs. Hayes, but you should understand that I'm not your enemy. I'm offering Mr. Reed a way out, a way to provide for you and your children. We don't need your help." "Don't you?" Blackwell's voice dropped, becoming softer, more dangerous. "Look around you, Mrs. Hayes. This land is dying. The drought isn't over. The Dust Bowl isn't finished. How long do you think you can survive out here? Another month? 6 months, a year? And when the food runs out again, when the well runs dry, when winter comes and there's no wood to burn, what then?" Margaret did not flinch. "Then we'll figure it out, like we figured out everything else." "Admirable, but foolish." Blackwell turned back to Samuel. "You have 3 days, Mr. Reed. After that, my offer drops to 600. And after that, the state moves in and you get nothing. Think about it. Think about what you're risking." He started to mount his horse, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. I've been talking to your neighbors. Most of them are selling. In fact, I've already purchased 4 properties in the last week. Soon you'll be surrounded by railroad land. No access to roads. No access to water rights. No way in or out except through property we control." He smiled. "Think about that too." The 3 men rode away. Samuel stood on the porch watching them go, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. Margaret climbed the steps and stood beside him. "Samuel, he's serious. If he buys the land around us—" "I know. We'll be trapped." "I know. So what are we going to do?" Samuel set down the rifle. He looked at Margaret. and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his eyes that looked like defeat. I don't know. That night, the house was thick with tension. The children ate in silence, picking up on the adults' mood. After dinner, Margaret put them to bed early, then returned to find Samuel sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the two letters from the state and the railroad company. You're thinking about selling, she said. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Margaret sat down across from him. Samuel, I know this land means everything to you. I know it's your father's legacy, but sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is know when to walk away. Samuel's jaw tightened. Is that what you think, that I should just give up? I think you should survive. I think you should choose life over pride. It's not about pride. Samuel slammed his hand on the table, making the letters jump. It's about principle. It's about not letting men like Blackwell steamroll over people just because they have money and lawyers and hired guns. And what good are principles if you're dead? What good is living if you have nothing left worth living for? Margaret recoiled as if struck. Nothing? You think this is nothing? She gestured around the house. These children who are alive because of you, me who you saved, the family we're building here? That's nothing. Samuel's face crumpled. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He stood and paced to the window, staring out at the darkness. I let Elizabeth go. I let James go. I told myself it was the right thing, that I was being noble, letting them have a better life. But the truth is, I gave up. I didn't fight for them because I was afraid of losing, so I just surrendered. He turned to face her. This land, it's not just dirt and fence paint. It's the one thing I haven't given up on. The one thing I haven't quit. If I sell now, if I walk away, then I'm the same man who let his wife and son leave without a fight. And I can't be that man anymore. I can't. Margaret stood and crossed to him. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You're not that man. You haven't been that man since the day you found us. That man would have ridden past our farm, would have told himself it wasn't his problem. But you didn't. You stopped. You helped. You saved us. That doesn't change what I did before. No, but it changes who you are now. And the man you are now, the man I've come to. She stopped, the word catching in her throat. Love. She had been about to say love, but it felt too soon, too fragile, too dangerous to speak aloud. Samuel saw the hesitation in her eyes. What? He asked softly. The man I've come to trust, she finished. That man doesn't need to prove anything by destroying himself. They stood like that for a long moment, her hands on his face, his eyes searching hers. Then slowly Samuel reached up and covered her hands with his. I don't know how to do this, he said. Do what? This. Care about people again. Let them matter. It's terrifying. I know. It terrifies me too. Why, Tom? Because I lost Jonathan. Because I almost lost my children. Because every time I start to feel safe, something happens to remind me that safety is an illusion. Samuel turned his head and kissed her palm. It was not a romantic gesture. It was something deeper. A promise. I can't make you safe, Margaret. I can't protect you from everything. But I can promise that I won't give up. That I'll fight for this. For us. For as long as I can. Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes. Even if fighting means losing, especially then. She wanted to argue, wanted to make him see reason. But she understood in that moment that this was not about reason. It was about something more fundamental. About a man trying to reclaim the parts of himself that he had given away. About refusing to be beaten even when beating seemed inevitable. All right, she whispered. Then we fight. The next morning, Samuel rode into town. He was gone for hours, and when he returned, his face was grim but determined. Well, Margaret asked. I talked to a lawyer. He says eminent domain is complicated. The state has to prove public necessity. They have to show that taking this land serves a greater good. That takes time, hearings, evidence. How much time? Months. Maybe a year. And what about Blackwell? Blackwell's working for the railroad, not the state. His deadline is meaningless. He's trying to scare people into selling cheap before the state moves in and they get even less. So we have time. We have a little time. But Margaret, you need to understand, even if we win the legal battle, we still lose. Because Blackwell was right. He's buying up all the land around us. Soon we'll be an island surrounded by railroad property. They can make our lives hell without ever technically breaking the law. Margaret absorbed this. What do? We talk to the neighbors, the ones who haven't sold yet. We organize, we fight back as a group. You think they'll listen? I don't know, but I have to try. That afternoon, Samuel rode out to visit the neighboring ranches. Margaret stayed behind with the children, trying to maintain normalcy, even as worry gnawed at her. She taught Jesse his letters. She helped Ruby practice walking, the child's legs growing stronger each day. She fed Grace and rocked her to sleep. And she thought about Samuel's words, I can't make you safe, but I won't give up. It was not the promise she wanted, but it might be the only promise anyone could make in a world as hard as this one. Samuel returned at dusk, and he was not alone. 7 men rode with him, all of them ranchers or farmers from the surrounding area. They dismounted in the yard, and Samuel led them into the house. Margaret recognized some of them. Henry Tucker, a former cavalry officer who had fought in the Spanish-American War. Frank Morrison, who ran cattle on land his grandfather had homesteaded. Wade Patterson, whose wife had died 2 years ago, leaving him to raise 3 daughters alone. Samuel introduced Margaret to each of them, then got down to business. Blackwell's been to all of us, Henry Tucker said. He was a big man in his 50s, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen violence and learned to handle it calmly. Offering money, making threats. Some folks have sold, but not all of us. How many have sold? Samuel asked. 4 that I know of, maybe more. That leaves how many who haven't? 8, including you. Samuel nodded. 8 ranches. If we coordinate, if we all refuse to sell, Blackwell can't isolate any one of us. But the state can still use eminent domain, Frank Morrison pointed out. We can delay it, but we can't stop it forever. No, but we can make it expensive. We can make it public. We can fight them in court and the newspapers anywhere we can. And maybe if we make enough noise, they'll decide it's easier to go somewhere else. Wade Patterson leaned forward. You really think we can win this? Samuel looked around the room at the weathered faces of men who had survived drought, depression, and disaster. I think we can try. And if we go down fighting, not because we gave up. Henry Tucker stood and extended his hand. I'm in. One by one, the other men stood and shook Samuel's hand. By the time they left, they had formed a coalition, an agreement to stand together against Blackwell and the railroad. After they left, Margaret found Samuel standing on the porch, looking out at the dark fields. You did a good thing tonight, she said. Maybe, or maybe I just convinced a bunch of stubborn men to go down with the ship. You gave them hope. That's not nothing. Samuel turned to her. In the moonlight, his face looked older, carved by worry and responsibility. Margaret, I need to tell you something. What? If this goes bad, if we lose everything, I need you to promise me that you'll take the children and leave. Go to town, find work, whatever it takes. Don't tie your fate to mine. Samuel, promise me. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No, Barry. I won't promise that because we're in this together now. You don't get to save me and then push me away when things get hard. That's not how this works. Margaret, I'm trying to protect you. And I'm trying to tell you that I don't want your protection if it means losing you. She stepped closer. We survive together or we fail together. But I won't leave, not unless you tell me to go. And even then, I might not listen. Samuel stared at her. Then without warning, he pulled her into his arms and held her. Not gently, not romantically, but desperately, like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Margaret held him back, feeling his heart pounding against her chest, feeling the tremors running through his body. This man, who seemed so strong, so unbreakable, was terrified. And he needed her. The realization was shocking and powerful and absolutely terrifying. I can't lose you, Samuel whispered into her hair. Not you, not the children. I can't. You won't, Margaret said, though she had no idea if it was true. We'll figure this out. Together. They stood like that until the cold drove them inside. And that night, for the first time, Samuel did not sleep by the fire. He slept in the back room, in the chair beside the bed, where Margaret and Grace slept, keeping watch, as if his presence alone could hold back the darkness. 3 days later, Owen Blackwell came back. But this time when he rode up to the ranch, he found not just Samuel, but 7 other men standing in the yard, and all of them armed, all of them waiting. Blackwell reined in his horse. He looked at the assembled ranchers, and for the first time his smile faltered. "Gentlemen," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware this was a group meeting." "It is now," Henry Tucker said. "We've been talking Blackwell, and we've decided that none of us are selling. Not to you, not to the railroad, not to the state. That's your right, but it's also pointless. The state will take what it wants. Maybe, but we're going to make it as difficult and as expensive as possible. We've hired a lawyer, we're filing for a hearing, and we're going to the newspapers. Every one of them. We're going to tell the story of how the state and the railroads are stealing land from farmers and ranchers who are just trying to survive." Blackwell's face hardened. "You're making a mistake." "That's possible, but it's our mistake to make." Blackwell looked at Samuel. "This is your doing." "No," Samuel said. "This is our doing, all of us." Blackwell turned his horse. Before he rode away, he looked back. "You think you've won something here, but you haven't. You've just made things harder for yourselves. And when the state comes, they won't negotiate. They'll just take." "Then let them try," Samuel said. Blackwell rode away. The men watched him go, then slowly dispersed, returning to their own ranches, their own fights. But something had changed. They were no longer isolated individuals trying to survive alone. They were a community, and that made all the difference. That night after the children were asleep, Samuel found Margaret in the kitchen. She was sewing by lamplight, repairing a tear in Ruby's dress. He sat down across from her. "Margaret, there's something I need to ask you." She looked up. "What?" Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Old worn, the kind of box that had been carried through time and hardship. He set it on the table between them. Margaret stared at it. "Samuel, just listen, please." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, silver simple with a small sapphire. "This was my mother's. She wore it for 40 years, through drought, through poverty, through everything. My father gave it to her when they got married, and she never took it off." He pushed the box toward Margaret. "I know this isn't perfect. I know I can't promise you an easy life. I can't even promise we'll still have this ranch in 6 months. But I can promise that I'll be here, that I'll fight for us, that I'll never give up." Margaret's hands trembled. "Samuel, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Samuel's face went completely blank. Then slowly a smile spread across his face, a real smile, not the careful, guarded expression he usually wore, but something open and genuine and full of wonder. "How long?" 2 months, maybe a little more." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was afraid. I thought maybe you'd feel trapped, that you'd think I was trying to force your hand." Samuel reached across the table and took her hands. "Margaret, you just told me that we're going to have a child." "Our child. That's not a trap. That's a gift. The best gift anyone's ever given me. Even with everything that's happening, the ranch Blackwell, all of it, especially with all of that, because it means we're building something that lasts, something that matters." Margaret looked at the ring. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. All right. Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel stood and pulled her to her feet, then into his arms. He kissed her, and it was not tentative or uncertain. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration that despite the odds, despite the danger, despite everything working against them, they were choosing each other. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret laughed. "We're crazy, you know that, getting married when we might lose everything." "Probably, but I'd rather be crazy with you than sane without you." They were married 2 weeks later in April of 1935. Not in a church, there was no church within 20 miles. But under the cottonwood tree near the barn with the 7 neighboring ranchers and their families as witnesses. Thomas held the Bible. Jesse and Ruby carried wildflowers. Grace wore a ribbon in her hair and laughed when the wind blew. Henry Tucker, as the senior man present, performed the ceremony. It was simple, no fancy vows, just, "Do you, Samuel Reed, take this woman?" "I do." "Do you, Margaret Hayes, take this man?" "I do." And then Samuel kissed his bride, and the small crowd cheered, and for just a moment, the weight of the world lifted. For just a moment, they were not people fighting for survival. They were a family celebrating love. After the ceremony, there was food. Not much, but everyone had contributed what they could. There was music, someone brought a fiddle, and dancing. Thomas danced with Ruby. Jesse fell asleep on a chair. Wade Patterson's three daughters taught Grace how to clap in rhythm. And Samuel and Margaret stood together, hands linked, watching it all, feeling grateful and terrified and hopeful all at once. Late in the afternoon, a rider approached. Everyone tensed, hands moving toward guns. But it was just the mail carrier bringing a letter. For Samuel Reed, postmark Topeka, Kansas. Dated 3 weeks ago, it had been delayed, forwarded twice before finding its way here. Samuel's hands shook as he opened it. The handwriting was a child's, but neater than the Bible inscription from 4 years ago. More mature. Dear Pa, Mama told me you got married. I'm happy for you. I hope she's nice. I remember the ranch. I remember the big tree and the barn and Elko. I remember you teaching me to ride. Mama says I can visit this summer if you want. I'd like that. I'd like to see you again. Your son, James Samuel, read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Margaret. She read it, tears forming in her eyes. You have to write back, she said. What do I say? Tell him yes. Tell him we want him to come. Tell him he has brothers and sisters now. Tell him he's part of this family. That night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper. Margaret sat beside him, helping him find the words. Dear James, thank you for your letter. Yes, please, come visit this summer. Stay as long as you want. You're always welcome here. You have a new stepmother, Margaret. She's strong and kind and smart. And you have brothers and sisters, Thomas, Jesse, Ruby, and Grace. They're excited to meet you. There's also a baby coming. You'll be a big brother. I know that's a lot, but I hope it makes you happy. I've thought about you every day since you left. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to keep you. I'm sorry I let so much time pass. But I want to make up for that now if you'll let me. The ranch is still here. Elko is still here. The tree, the barn, all of it. It's your home, James. It always has been. I love you. I've always loved you. Your father, they mailed the letter the next day. Then they waited. Summer came slowly to Texas in 1935. The drought continued, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. There was still dust, still heat, still hardship. But there was also rain, just enough to keep things from dying completely. Margaret's pregnancy progressed. By June, she was showing her belly swelling with new life. The children were fascinated. Thomas asked endless questions about how babies grew. Jesse wanted to know if they could have a brother. Ruby patted Margaret's stomach and talked to the baby, and Samuel watched over them all with a fierce protectiveness that would have been frightening if it wasn't also deeply reassuring. In late July, they got word that the state's eminent domain case was being delayed. Something about paperwork, something about public hearings that needed to be scheduled. It was not a victory, but it was a reprieve. On August 15, 1935, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, a wagon appeared on the horizon. Samuel saw it first. He was on the porch, and he stood slowly, shading his eyes against the light. The wagon drew closer. A woman was driving, and beside her a boy with blonde hair and gray eyes. Samuel's throat closed. He could not speak, could not move, could only stand there as the wagon pulled up to the gate and stopped. James climbed down. He looked so much older than Samuel remembered. 11 years old, tall for his age, thin. He wore clothes that were too nice for farm work, city clothes, Boston clothes. For a long moment, father and son just looked at each other. 4 years of absence, 4 years of longing, 4 years of wondering if they would ever see each other again. Then James said, "Hi, Pa." And Samuel was moving, striding across the yard and pulling his son into his arms. James went stiff at first, surprised. Then his arms came up slowly and wrapped around Samuel's back. "I missed you," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too, Pa." They stood like that until Elizabeth, James' mother, cleared her throat. Samuel released James and turned to face her. She looked exactly as he remembered. Pretty refined, uncomfortable in the rural setting, but her eyes were kind when she looked at him. "Hello, Samuel." "Elizabeth, thank you for bringing him. He wanted to come, and I thought it was time." Margaret appeared on the porch holding Grace. Thomas, Jesse, and Ruby clustered around her. James looked at them, his eyes wide. Are those your brothers and sisters? Samuel said. Come meet them. The introductions were awkward but sweet. Thomas shook James's hand solemnly. Jesse hugged him. Ruby asked if he knew how to play hopscotch. And Grace, not understanding any of it, just smiled and reached for James's hair. Margaret stood back, letting Samuel have this moment. But when James looked at her, she smiled. Welcome, James. We're glad you're here. Thank you, ma'am. Call me Margaret. That night, Elizabeth stayed for dinner, but then left to stay with friends in town, giving James space to reconnect with his father. The meal was chaotic, all the children talking at once, James trying to keep track of names and faces and relationships. After dinner, Samuel and James walked out to the barn together. They stood in the doorway looking at the stars beginning to appear overhead. The ranch looks different, James said. It's been 4 years. Things change. You seem different too. How so? James thought about it. Happier maybe, less lonely. Samuel nodded. I was very lonely after you left. I didn't realize how lonely until Margaret and the children came. Do you love her? Yes. Does she love you? I think so. I hope so. James was quiet for a moment. Mama said you let us go because you loved us, because you wanted us to be happy. That's true, but it made you sad, very sad. I'm sorry, Pa. Samuel looked down at his son. You have nothing to be sorry for. None of this was your fault. It was mine. I should have fought harder. I should have come to visit. I should have done a lot of things differently. But you're doing them now with Margaret and the kids. I'm trying to be the father I should have been to you. James reached out and took Samuel's hand. You were a good father, Pa. I remember. You taught me to ride. You fixed my toys when they broke. You read to me at night. I remember all of it. Samuel felt tears building behind his eyes. Thank you for remembering. They stood together in the comfortable silence that exists between fathers and sons who understand each other. Then James said, Can I stay longer than 2 weeks? How much longer? Maybe all summer. I'd like that very much. Me too. The summer passed in a golden haze. James fit into the family as if he had always been there. He taught Thomas more advanced engineering concepts. He played endless games with Jesse and Ruby. He was gentle with Grace, and he helped Samuel with the heavy work, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Margaret's pregnancy advanced. By mid-August, she was 8 months along, moving slowly, her back aching, but still working, still managing the household with quiet efficiency. On August 20th, as the heat of the day was fading into evening, Margaret felt the first contraction. She was hanging laundry and had to grip the clothesline to stay upright as the pain rolled through her. Samuel, she called, her voice tight. He came running. One look at her face and he understood. It's time, it's time. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Samuel sent Thomas to fetch Mrs. Patterson, the midwife. James and Jesse took Ruby and Grace to the barn, keeping them distracted. Samuel stayed with Margaret, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. Mrs. Patterson arrived and took over, her competent hands and calm voice soothing Margaret through the worst of the pain. Samuel stayed in the room, refusing to leave despite the midwife's suggestion that he wait outside. I've seen worse in the war, he said. I'm staying. At 2 in the morning on August 21st, 1935, Samuel Daniel Reed was born. He was small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. He came into the world screaming, announcing his arrival with absolute certainty. Samuel held his son, this tiny person who was half him and half Margaret, and felt something in his chest crack open. He had thought he understood love when James was born, but that had been complicated by Elizabeth's unhappiness, by the knowledge that something was already going wrong. This was different. This was pure. This was a second chance at everything. Margaret, exhausted but smiling, watched Samuel cradle the baby. He's perfect, she whispered. He's ours. We did it. We did. 3 days later, they brought the baby out to meet his brothers and sisters. James held him first, cradling his new brother with the careful reverence of an older sibling who understands the responsibility. Thomas and Jesse took turns looking at the tiny face. Ruby declared him the cutest baby ever. And Grace, now a toddler of 18 months, patted his head gently and said, Baby, mine. That night, as Margaret nursed Samuel Jr. and the other children slept, Samuel sat beside the bed watching them. His wife, his infant son. And in the other rooms, 5 other children, all of them alive, all of them here because he had made one decision 4 months ago to stop his horse and offer help to strangers. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked softly. Samuel looked at her. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am, how close I came to missing all of this." "You didn't miss it. You're here. Only because you gave me a reason to be." "No, you gave yourself a reason. You chose this. You chose us." Samuel leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Best decision I ever made." The hearing on the eminent domain case came in September. Samuel Henry Tucker and 3 other ranchers traveled to the county seat to present their case. They had hired a lawyer, a young man fresh out of law school, who believed in fighting for the underdog. Together, they argued that the state had failed to prove public necessity, that the railroad's real purpose was profit, not progress, that taking this land would destroy families and communities. The hearing lasted 3 days. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of a delay, ordering the state to provide more evidence of public need. It was not a victory, but it bought them time. Maybe months, maybe a year, maybe long enough for the political winds to shift and the whole project to be abandoned. When Samuel returned home and told Margaret the news, she cried, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it felt like grief. "It's not over," Samuel cautioned. "They'll appeal. They'll keep fighting." "I know, but we got time. That's something in. That's everything." They stood together on the porch, watching James teach Thomas how to throw a rope, watching Jesse and Ruby chase chickens, watching Grace toddle after them on unsteady legs. Inside, Samuel Jr. slept in his cradle, blissfully unaware of the battles being fought to protect his future. "We should name the ranch," Margaret said suddenly. Samuel looked at her. "What? Give it a proper name. Something that means something. So when our children ask where they're from, they have an answer." Samuel thought about it. "What name?" Margaret smiled. "Hayes Reed Ranch. Both families, both of us. Together." Samuel nodded slowly. "I like that. Hayes Reed Ranch." 2 days later, he and James worked together to carve a sign. They used good oak, the kind that would last. James, who had his father's steady hands and patience, did most of the carving while Samuel guided him. When they were finished, they mounted the sign on the gate. Hayes Reed Ranch. The letters were not perfect, but they were made with love and care, and that made them beautiful. That evening, the whole family gathered at the gate to look at the sign. Margaret stood with Samuel Jr. in her arms. Samuel stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other on James's. The other children clustered around them, a tangle of arms and legs and laughter. "This is us," Samuel said. "This is who we are. Hayes Reed Ranch, a place where families are built, where second chances are real, where we don't give up, no matter what." "No matter what," Thomas repeated solemnly. The others echoed it. Even Grace, who barely understood, said the words in her small voice. "No matter what." They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in impossible colors, casting long shadows across the land that had nearly killed them, but instead had given them everything. They stood together, this patchwork family held together by love and stubbornness, and the simple choice to keep going when everything said to quit. A year later, Margaret would give birth to a daughter, naming her Hope. The eminent domain case would eventually be dropped when the railroad company shifted its focus to another region. Owen Blackwell would disappear, rumored to have been arrested for fraud in another state. The drought would continue for another 3 years, but the Hayes Reed family would survive it, their community of neighboring ranches growing stronger, with each challenge faced together. James would choose to stay, spending every summer at the ranch and eventually moving there permanently when he turned 16. He would become an engineer, just like his father, using his skills to help modernize the ranches in the area, bringing water and power to places that had known only hardship. Thomas would follow in James's footsteps, becoming known as one of the finest mechanical engineers in Texas, crediting everything he knew to the lessons learned in his father's workshop. Jesse would become a teacher. Ruby would become a nurse, inspired by her mother's stories of the war. Grace would marry a neighboring rancher's son and build her own family on adjacent land. But all of that was in the future, unknowable and uncertain. On this evening in September of 1935, they were simply a family standing together, looking at a sign that proclaimed their identity and their commitment to each other. Margaret leaned against Samuel, feeling his strength, his steadiness, his love. "We made it," she whispered. "We did. Do you ever think about that day when you found us?" "Every day." "What do you think about?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think about how close I came to riding past, how easy it would have been to tell myself it wasn't my problem, how I almost did, but something made me stop. Something made me look. And because of that, I got all of this." He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "You asked me once why I helped you. I told you it was because I'd seen enough people die. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth is I was dying too. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I was a ghost haunting my own life, going through motions without purpose or meaning. And then I found you and your children, and suddenly I had a reason to be alive again." Margaret felt tears building. "You saved us." "No, we saved each other." And that in the end was the truth of it. In a time and place where survival seemed impossible, where the land itself seemed determined to kill them, they had found each other. They had built something that mattered. They had created a family not from blood or obligation, but from choice and love, and the stubborn refusal to give up. The Hayes Reed Ranch would stand for generations, its story told and retold, becoming legend. People would speak of the widow and her dying children, of the rancher who saved them, of the family that stood against those who would have taken everything. They would speak of how love and stubbornness in simple human decency could overcome almost anything. But for now, on this September evening in 1935, they were just a family, imperfect, scared, hopeful, standing together under a sky so vast it made them feel both insignificant and eternal. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.